Observers say the recent tension between Singapore and Indonesia over the naming of an Indonesian warship should serve as a learning lesson for both countries. Indonesia made the decision to name a Navy ship after two Marines who bombed McDonald House in Singapore in 1965, killing 3 civilians. This took place during the period of konfrontasi or confrontation, when Indonesia launched an undeclared war as part of its political and armed opposition to the creation of Malaysia. At that time, the new Malaysia comprised Singapore, the Federation of Malaya, Sabah and Sarawak. In a special midweek edition of Spotlight, Monica Kotwani takes a look at the events leading to the confrontation and what the recent naming decision means for relations between Singapore and Indonesia.
It was 1963. Singapore was part of a newly formed Malaysia. Then Indonesian President Sukarno, however, had other plans for Singapore. A campaign of terror and sabotage called the Konfrontasi or confrontation was launched. It was meant to disrupt the lives of Singaporeans, demoralize them and undermine their faith in their leaders. Jakarta sent saboteurs to plant bombs in Singapore, and in total saboteurs set off more than 40 explosions in Singapore. Several caused injuries and death. On April 13, 1964, an explosion at Jalan Rebong off Changi Road killed a widow and her only daughter. 6 others were injured. 3 days later, there was an explosion in the telephone booth off Jalan Eunos, injuring 5. But it was the McDonald House bombing on March 10, 1965 that left the most vivid memory of the confrontasi among Singaporeans. A bomb planted by 2 Indonesian Marines rocked the building, tearing a massive hole in the floor and ripping out a lift door. Windows within a 100-meter radius of the building were shattered, including those of vehicles passing by. The bomb killed 3 people and injured 33 others. The 2 Indonesian Marines, Usman Muhammad Ali and Harun Said, were arrested 4 days later. The widespread anger felt by Singaporeans against the spate of bombings which killed innocent men, women and children prompted nearly 15,000 people to sign up for a new Vigilante Corps or VC. The wholly voluntary VC worked closely with the police in counter-sabotage operations to protect the lives and property of Singaporeans. After 3 years of attacks, the confrontation formally ended in August 1966. Despite a plea for clemency from Indonesia's new President Suharto, Singapore hanged the 2 Indonesian Marines responsible for the McDonald House bombing 2 years later on 17 October 1968.
When the hanging was going to take place, Indonesia actually massed their navy along the coast of Changi. And we were deployed along Tanah Merah and Changi beaches to defend Singapore. It was like, everything was real. Live rounds were given and we were ammunition and everything else, sitting on the beaches in trenches waiting for a landing.
On the day the 2 men were hanged, the Singapore embassy in Jakarta was sacked, furniture was smashed and the Singapore flag was burnt.
How could we have answered to the victims and their families and to Singaporeans if we had set these 2 men free? The not pardoning Usman and Harun was actually a defining moment for Singapore in terms of our foreign policy. If we had agreed to release them, then that would have set the precedent for our relationship with all bigger countries.
Singapore did, however, release 45 other saboteurs. In Indonesia, the 2 men were declared heroes and given ceremonial burials. Relations remained tense for several years until then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew visited Indonesia in 1973 and scattered flowers on the graves of the Marines. The gesture won over the hearts of many Indonesians and was the key to a turning point for better relations between the 2 countries. So it came as a surprise to many Singaporeans when the Indonesian Navy decided to name one of its ships Usman Harun after the 2 Indonesian Marines.
I feel that once the Lee Kuan Yew put flowers, the matter is settled. You should not take it out again. They are already in heroes' grave.
For years, both countries considered the matter closed, and Singapore and Indonesian relations have grown from strength to strength. Last year, trade between the two countries reached almost $75 billion, and Singapore was also Indonesia's second largest foreign investor. So the recent decision to name the ship after the Marines have reopened old wounds. 3 high-ranking Singapore ministers called their counterparts in Jakarta to voice Singapore's concern and to point out that the naming of a warship after the Indonesian Marines was insensitive to the feelings of Singaporeans and the families of the McDonald House victims.
It is quite important for us to know that the Marines are not being honored for killing Singaporeans. And it is also important for us that it is understood and acknowledged that the naming of the ship impacts on us and impacts on our sensitivities.
The tension between the two countries prompted Singapore to withdraw an invitation to the Indonesian Navy's Chief of Staff, as well as to some 100 junior officers, to this year's Singapore Air Show. The question now is, how will this latest incident affect bilateral relations between the two countries? Indonesian Foreign Minister Dr. Marty Natalegawa said he is confident that the two sides will move forward in the future.
The fact that this decision was made, perhaps of the naming of the vessels, was, I guess, made under the assumption as if this has been a closed chapter, right, in 1973, and therefore those who had made the decision must have felt that this should not cause any more furore because it's already so closed. And obviously it hasn't. It is creating some new dynamics. So we are drawing the appropriate lessons learned from it in terms of both of us, Indonesia and Singapore, I'm sure, and we will move forward.
One expert agrees that both sides will see to it that good sense prevails, but emphasizes that it is a timely reminder for both countries.
When you are a large state, when you see yourself as a rising middle power, acting on the global stage, it is often possible that you may not be as aware of how your actions are perceived by your neighbors. We hope that with the reaction to an incident which the Indonesians thought would have no impact on relations, this would be a learning experience for Indonesia and the Indonesian leadership.
But for Singaporeans, it's also a lesson that they live in a region where peace, goodwill and friendship should not be taken for granted.